Hello, everybody, and welcome to this seminar organised by the Queer Kinship Network. My name is Charlotte Ross, and I'm Professor of Italian and Gender at the University of Oxford, and I'm here with my colleagues, the co-directors of the network, Paolo Frasca and Silvia Antosa.
Salve a tutti, io sono Paolo Frasca. This is Paolo Frasca. I teach at the University of Toronto, but I'm currently connected from Calabria in Italy. Silvia, off to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Silvia Antosa. I teach English literature and cultural studies at the University for Foreigners in Siena. Welcome to you all.
Thank you. And today with us we have the special guest, Dr. Francesca Romana Ammaturo, who is joining us from London. She is a senior lecturer in Sociology and International Relations at London Metropolitan University. And she's going to be speaking to us based on her brilliant recent book, The Politics of Pride Events, published by Bristol University Press last year. And this is a seminar which is celebrating Pride Month. There are all kinds of important events happening all over the world. And Francesca's research has been focusing on this for over the last 10 years, exploring various different dimensions of Pride events from an empirical perspective, thinking about more rural events, thinking about larger urban events, and looking at the challenges of organizing prides, all of the different political debates that emerge around that time, and thinking about the significance of Pride events during this Pride Month, the kind of tensions, the hostilities that people may sometimes unfortunately face, and the kinds of community and kinship that are developed within those events. So today, Francesca is going to be talking to us about litigious kinship. So there's going to be some quite interesting and quite difficult topics, I think, that she'll bring up, but which are really fundamental for discussion. It's really important to reflect on these things together. Pride events between internal conflicts and community building. So I'll pass over to Francesca now. If you are listening on the live stream, welcome. If you'd like to put a question in the chat, then please make sure that you are registered, that you sign up to our YouTube channel, and then you'll be able to put a question in the chat, because Francesca will be speaking for a little while, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion, and all of your comments and questions are very welcome. Francesca, thank you so much for being with us today, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte and Silvia and Paolo, for the invitation. It's a true pleasure to be here with you, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation that can be sort of anticipated from some of the ideas that I will be sharing with you. I don't have slides, so I'm going to try to have a conversation that is kind of free-floating, but actually it's quite structured in the sense that it's coming from what I have been writing about, as you said, in the book, and also some quite super fast, quite intense developments that I have been witnessing in the last 4 months, when my phone has basically been pinging about Pride events every 5 minutes, because I hadn't anticipated that Pride events would become or get into the eye of the storm as much as I have witnessed. And this is true for a whole variety of countries. So we can definitely see that there is a global dimension relating to Pride events that really needs to thought about in the midst or in the context of the very difficult political times that we are encountering. It will come to no surprise that we are living in countries of what many scholars call democratic backsliding, erosion of international protections of LGBTQI rights, but not just from an intersectional perspective, not just LGBTQI plus rights, the rights of migrants, the rights relating to anti-racism, the rights of disabled people, the rights more broadly in terms of freedom of expression, assembly and association, which are greatly imperiled around the world, even more because of the rise of the far right and authoritarian governments and censorship around diversity, equality and inclusion. So this is the kind of background, obviously, that everybody is experiencing, and a background that kind of sort of serves as the lightning rod for Pride events to articulate their response and to provide an alternative, whether we want to call it a heterotopia or a utopia, depending on the sort of theoretical approach that we want to take, to the quite grim times that we are experiencing. Charlotte said I've been researching Pride events for many years at this point. It started as a side project for my PhD because I was bored of looking at case law from the European Court of Human Rights. No, I mean, this is a bit of a joke. What I wanted is that I had been going to Pride events as a young lesbian, in my 20s, and I found them extremely fascinating, and I thought that they had such an interest from a sociological perspective that I started to document visually what I was experiencing. But I also started to realize how central Pride events were to an articulation of local and global politics of LGBTQI plus activism. And I think, for people who've been studying Pride for a long time, which, preceded me, of course, because the scholarship around Pride started around the late 80s and really developed throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. People have started to understand the sort of sense of community building, the idea of chosen families, the idea of being visibly in public with others that made us feel seen, represented, and heard. But it kind of had been taken as a sort of a static object of research. So, we kind of know what the formula of a Pride event is a kind of a march, which often has rainbow symbols, which often, happens in a city, which has people maybe chanting, being on floats, experiencing a whole range of multisensorial sort of events. And I kind of wanted to challenge that idea that we kind of know what Pride events are. So all of my research so far has been about deconstructing the meanings and the plurality of Pride events that we can observe. And this has culminated, in the production of the book that I have done with 60 activists around the world, from 30 different countries, actually 29 plus an autonomous territory of the Faroe Islands, if we want to be pedantic about geography. And it's a research that I haven't done through ethnography, which is very often what Pride research is done through in terms of methodological approach, mostly because I didn't have any funding to do the research. And my research came out of the COVID pandemic. So it was an attempt to understand the sense of isolation and frustration that activists organizing Pride events had experienced for the 2 years in a row where their events hadn't taken place. So why is this research, how is this research speaking to what we're experiencing now? I've given a bit of a background in terms of what is happening, but also within LGBTQI community, Pride events have skyrocketed in terms of their magnitude, in terms of their spread, in terms of their diversity. And this is a phenomenon, if we were to take a sort of research approach, an epistemological approach that hasn't really been documented properly. So, for instance, the explosion of Pride events hasn't really been conceptualized that well, in the last 10 years. So I think we are sitting on a huge amount of interesting and wonderful knowledge that still needs to be developed. So what we have seen is that Pride events have become multi-million, particularly in global urban centers, multi-million events, comparable to things such as, a Taylor Swift concert or Coachella or Burning Man. So they kind of attract that same magnitude of crowds, but they've also spread in small centers, like peripheral locations, even within cities. So for instance, in France, we have La Pride des Banlieues. We have a lot of peripheral pride in the different boroughs here in London, in Berlin, in New York, many other global cities, but also Pride events in rural places. And we also have witnessed the legacy of the diversification of Pride events that has resulted from the splintering of Pride events into two sort of camps: mainstream Pride events, the kind of that I was describing earlier, and those that cater for more specific segments of the society, that, for instance, cater for trans rights or Black communities, or dyke marches, which were quite popular during the 90s and 2000s. and other forms of pride, like bisexual pride, migrant pride, and so forth. So why am I saying all of this? Because there is one, I'm not going to touch on everything, of course, but there is one main criticism that we very often encounter when we think about the multiplication of pride events. And this is something that I have encountered quite a lot with the people I have spoken to. Because in the research I have spoken to, most of the organizers were organizing what we would call mainstream pride events, but some of them were organizing fringe or alternative pride events, for instance, trans pride or black pride, or this kind of events that were more grassroots. And the accusation very often leveled from mainstream pride organizers towards these fringes is that by organizing alternative pride events, they are sort of like, splintering their community in times in which we actually need to be standing up together. So you can see that this is kind of an internal pressure that comes from within, and there are some fictions that sort of accompany this narrative. The first fiction is that we are all in the same sort of kinship, in the same family. And this is a narrative that when it comes to pride, and I'm not the first to say this, there's plenty of historians who've done this work, which I have merely related back in my book. The first iterations of pride events, if we want to take the sort of legacy of the Stonewall riots in the US, were very much riddled with problems with exclusion. So not only mainstream pride events organizers, if we're thinking about New York 1970, in the year 1970, they were fighting for the inclusion of, with other communities, for the inclusion of trans and gender non-conforming people, but they were also fighting with the Black communities and the Black Panthers. They were fighting with lesbian communities, and they were fighting with disabled communities, which didn't feel represented at all. So there were major fractures that made that the first iterations of pride, those that we currently understand as the sort of mythological moment of Stonewall, were actually already inherently exclusionary. So, this legacy has never been about inclusivity because it was pretty much axed around the interests and the sort of representational politics of respectability that was congenial to mostly white, cis, middle-class gay men, if we're talking about urban America, for instance. So that is the first fiction, that we are all, a big family that's always been standing up for pride together. The second fiction is that pride represents the whole host of experiences that can be possibly embodied when one leaves behind a backward place. So that's why the emergence of alternative pride events in rural and peripheral settings kind of contradict that narratives that the only place to be queer, if we want to follow Albert Stamm's work on metronormativity, the only place when one can be queer, and I would add modernly queer, is the city. Because you can be queer in other places, but you'll always be you'll always experience a lingering feeling of backwardness, of being in a backward place. So I'm thinking particularly, as a person from Southern Italy, it's kind of idea that only, the big cities can offer you the kind of queer life you want. So this is the other tension, that the cities are the places where pride happens, and then everyone who wants to go to pride has to somehow migrate, even if it's for one day, make the trajectory towards the big city. And then also the big contradiction that exists at the moment is, and that has been existing very well documented in the literature, most probably the most well documented and discussed issue is the question of commercialization of pride events. So this idea that, and this is something that Dennis Altman was already talking about in the early 70s, when he said that the LGBT community was the only one that had, if we're thinking about the new social movements of the 60s and the 70s, women's rights, Black civil rights, environmental rights, Altman said the LGBT movement is the only one who has happily embraced commercialization, that has made commercialization as something that is congenial or advancing of the claims relating to sexual orientation. In particular, I would say much less gender identity, of course. So if we're thinking here particularly about commodified, white, cis, gay, middle-class experiences. So what does it mean is that over the course of the last 30 years, Pride events have happily hosted a whole plethora of corporate sponsors that haven't necessarily just supported Pride as a sort of a gesture of goodwill, but I would even go as far as saying they have colonized the space of Pride, that have imposed their presence quite aggressively in some cases. I mean, London Pride is an example of the hollowing out of, I always use London Pride as kind of like, do not become like that kind of model. So this hollowing out of any meaningful space for community in favor of a quite relentless, unabashed form of rainbow capitalism. Now, this is mitigated, of course, by what has happened in the US in the last couple of years with Trump and the crusade, anti-DEI crusade that has led to the real sort of like the mask has been removed. This idea that corporate sponsors were never fully in it for, the equality cause, but they were sort of like pinkwashing their reputation, and they obviously have dropped sponsorship quite swiftly. So there is another tension here. The moment in which corporate sponsors disappeared and the moment in which public support for Pride events wanes. We've seen that when far-right politicians come into power, they also start subtracting or taking back funds that have been allocated to Pride events. Then what happens is that activists are left, as I said in the book, between a rock and a hard place. So they don't access corporate funding, which we might be against if we are anti-capitalist, if we are anti-colonial, but they also cannot enjoy public funding anymore. So they kind of are in this sort of funding desert when it's not really clear what is the right financial strategy. So it's kind of a strained relationship between, the corporate sponsors, but also the people. Imagine the local council or the mayors or the sort of like local authorities that were previously, building a relationship of trust. And last but not least, with the securitization of many crises around the world, we've started with, in the last few years, in the last 5 years, I would say, we've started with Ukraine. But then, obviously, this feeling of securitization has been exacerbated with the genocide in Gaza. Pride organizers have had to really think hard about the position that they would take in relation to the militarization of Pride or the sort of celebration of military forces or kind of political alliances with actors within and outside the LGBTQI+ movement that espoused or denounced Zionist positions. And this is a rift that has proved to be quite important in terms of how much it has festered. Some countries have encountered this in more virulent forms than others. And, we can cite Italy, of course, for the Italian colleagues who are, listening to this. But, we can also think about Germany, where this is something that I have heard from a colleague who's working on protests against Pride events in Germany last week at a conference. There is now this idea that there are Antifa and non-Antifa versions of Pride, in a way that is sort of like really bringing up some very ugly feelings about, what kind of Pride politics needs to be about. And this is kind of based on this idea that Pride needs to be a hollow container. Pride needs to be neutral. Pride cannot be political. And obviously that is a fiction in itself because, we can trace back a lot of historical connections, both within the global north, but also obviously if we start looking from a more decolonial perspective across many countries in the southern cone. So for instance, in Latin America, if we think about Brazil, if we think about Argentina, if we think about Colombia. So when the fight against the dictatorships, particularly right-wing dictatorships, went hand in hand with the development of progressive politics of support for sexual orientation and gender identity causes. We can also cite Spain, for instance, in this instance, or, as I have done in the book and also in a recent blog that I wrote, the case of South Africa, when activists were contemporaneously fighting against white supremacy and apartheid and against homotransphobia, which led to the approval of the quote-unquote Rainbow Constitution of South Africa in 1996, amongst other things, which is not obviously a perfect instrument, but it kind of came out of that political process. So we are in a difficult moment where there is this sort of, what I would imagine, sort of like I could almost call a resignification of pride, that we are trying to resignify what pride is for. And this is a form of appropriation from the far right. So this idea that there are now gay conservatives, reform conservatives, if you are in the UK, or AfD conservatives that can in Germany, and Vox conservatives in Spain, pro-Milei or pro-Trump supporters that can actually reclaim and occupy pride and, resignify what pride is from a liberal, very narrow liberal perspective, is part and parcel of that same project of resignification of the human rights language that we have seen with women's rights, with trans rights, with migrants' rights, that has effectively attacked human rights and protection as a whole. So pride is a very easy space to occupy in an antagonistic way, and to break up those sort of kinship and those sort of senses of solidarity. It's a little bit like, because, we focus on kinship here. It's kind of those broad families where the relations are quite tense and everything can tip them in the wrong sense, in the wrong way. So in a way, pride was always constructed, because of the history that I mentioned, as a very uncomfortable broad church of people that were kind of together, but they probably sometimes had very different platforms. So, for instance, we take the issue of genocide in Palestine. Obviously, Pride organizers haven't discovered that Palestine existed, after 7th of October. So the questions around Zionist and anti-Zionist factions within Pride has been going on for a long time. Canada is a good example of that, with the queers against Israeli apartheid, that kind of really became a problem in the mid-2010, this sort of big fight between different factions. But there's this idea that space needs to be now created for a version of pride that is not just palatable, but it's quite adherent to a certain vision of homonormative and homo-nationalist protection of human rights. Just to give you an example, here where I am in the UK, there is, I can't remember now the town, because again, I have so much information that is, being accumulated on my phone. But there was recently this very big issue it's quite a small town that was organizing Pride, and there were 10 drag queens that were scheduled to be participating to the lineup. And they all withdrew their work when they found out that the organizer of the Pride event was a counselor that is basically a reform counselor, so a far right member of the local council. And there was in particular this controversy around one of them, who herself is of Polish origin, and her name is Stelia Jobs. So, this kind of contrast between this incongruence between organizing Pride and advocating for a nationalist, migrant-hating, trans-hating kind of campaign or platform. So where does it leave us? When the question that we ask is, so if we are splintering Pride, if we're going to trans Pride, if we are having a mainstream and an anti-capitalist Pride, what we're doing, we are effectively dividing ourselves, and those who are going to benefit are the far right or the anti-gender movements. We are asking a question that already implies that the power relations have been firmly in one camp. So only those who have already power, in this case, mainstream pride organizations, can have the privilege of asking themselves this question. Because for those who have been in the margins, for those for whom pride was never safe, for whom pride was always a problem in terms of their migration status or accessibility or their trans identity, this is a question that is actually quite symbolically violent in a way, because it shuts down the necessity of having a democratic conversation within pride organizing about what pride is for. So the fighting for the far right against the far right cannot be the only common denominator as a political platform if everyone who is actually most affected is left out of that conversation. And it's also important to think about that the fact that the multiplication of spaces where pride events are held are in themselves an act of resistance that is geographical in nature, that is reiterative in nature. So it's a much more powerful, and that's why a lot of particularly rural pride events now are in the eye of the storm. It's much more powerful to have your own county, your own region peppered with tens of prides that just have a one mainstream pride that is located in the big city and that you don't have to deal with. And when I say this, I mean that a lot of pride events in small locations, this is true for the UK, it's true for Italy, it's true for Germany that I know of, I think it's true for Spain, in France to some extent, are those that have been attacked the most in the last few months. Like flags have been burned, participants have been intimidated. I mean, we've also seen very horrific things at Rome Pride, for instance, with, pepper spraying participants, with children involved, and, sort of like very worrying attacks. But more rural locations are the ones that are suffering the most, precisely because they have sort of thinnest infrastructure that can easily collapse. So this is why when we think about, the multiplication of pride as a problem or a strategical mistake, what we are effectively advocating is for a very one-dimensional politics that doesn't allow any democratic debate within the community, kind of adopting the same authoritarian methods of the people that, needs to be combated in one sense. I am painting a very kind of gloomy picture so far, but the truth is that by multiplying, by diversifying, by thinking creatively also about their spaces, people who are organizing pride events in what I would call unexpected places are effectively changing the effective, legal, social, and political geography of our cities, of our towns, and our villages. And they are also telling us that there are other ways of doing community and kinship that are not just around the issue of single lane politics. So that our coalitions need to be with local associations, our coalition needs to be with migrant associations, they have to be with anti-racist networks, they have to be with environmental actors that are also fighting for a future in their respective locations. So I think that resistance in small places, resistance in places where being visibly trans or being visibly Black or being visibly disabled are actually essential to diversify this narrative that is mostly normative homo-nationalist about a very muscular version of homosexuality, that it kind of becomes detached, particular male homosexuality, that kind of becomes detached from the idea of kinship. And this idea that only a portion of the LGBTQI community can effectively insulate themselves from the attacks of the far right by giving the side, by asking for certain privileges, while sort of shipping others to sort of fend for themselves, and to sort of having to weather attacks to their right. There's so much more to say, but I don't want to take too much time, but I'm very happy to take questions on any of the things that I've said and beyond. So thank you for having me once again.
Thank you so much, Francesca. That was incredibly rich, so much detail there. And it really just goes to confirm the breadth and the depth and the richness of all the research that you've been doing, and the contacts that you've developed and the knowledge that you have, that you are able to draw on the research you've done in the past and what you've published, but also to update it in almost in real time in terms of what's been going on in the last few months and weeks. So many things to begin with. I mean, one of the things I wanted to pick up on was the idea of, I suppose, metronormativity, the idea of needing the queers need to leave the rural backwardness and go to the big city, and there they would find other people like them, or they would be part of this kind of narrative of modernization and forward-looking queer homosexuality or queerness in any way, and the idea that that's not available in the provinces, that it wouldn't be possible there, and increasingly, as you were saying, it's being, I suppose, counterbalanced by the organizations of these smaller, more local prides. But obviously, one of the attractions potentially of going to pride in a big city is the relative anonymity, particularly if we're thinking about things in a hostile climate, and there are obviously advantages and problems with that, because it can be relatively anonymous, which means it's safe for you to go there. You might not be recognized, and you can have that moment of experiencing your identity to the full, even if it's only for one day. Or it's possible to, very unlikely that you might bump into somebody who knows you, for example, if you're not out at work. But what it means is that you do have that corporate sponsorship, and you have that commercial and the capitalist dimension, which, as you're saying, have kind of hollowed out some of the issues that are very close to people's hearts in terms of their everyday lives and their individual politics. Being out in a local pride, a small local pride, is potentially making people even more vulnerable. So I wondered whether you could say a little bit more about what you have discovered about those kinds of scenarios in your research today, and in your reflections on the current moment.
Thank you for that, Charlotte. So there is an established literature about rural queerness, which is mostly drawing from North American and Australian, and to some extent UK experiences, although are much less developed. It kind of really traces an effective way of doing queerness that is very different from urban settings. So this idea of, I don't want to use the word emotional labor, because I think it's quite, we kind of make it a little bit banal when we say that. But being visibly queer in rural spaces or peripheral spaces definitely requires a higher level of negotiation between different allegiances. And this is something that I also encountered with my sort of small research piece that I did 10 years ago with Salento and Southern Italian pride organizers, who were always telling me about how they really needed to carefully negotiate places of visibility and invisibility. And it also means for pride that things might have to be more ephemeral and less on the nose. And that's why our imagination about pride can change, because that's why I was saying, we kind of have an imaginary, what I kind of discuss in the book as pride literacy, and that we all need to become well versed in, right? If we want to attend pride, we need to know the right slogans, we need to wear the right dresses, we need to talk about the right thing, have the right demeanor. But in many rural locations, a march or a parade might not always be the right thing to do. And so there are other ways of showing, kind of building community without being too on the nose of the people that we are trying to sort of like raise awareness with. So an example that I used in the book is, I mentioned the Faroe Islands already, and the Faroe Islands only have 50,000 inhabitants. So they are a very sparsely populated, quite isolated community that has quite a strong, although small, proportionally, Bible Belt, which is a kind of, very small piece of the islands that is quite religious and quite conservative. So the way in which they have gone around this sort of problem of religiosity and hostility is, for instance, devising, at least when I talk to them, and I don't know whether things have changed now, devising a kind of pride events that was organized through driving. So it was a driving event where people would just drive in droves around the islands, maybe waving a little flag, but it wasn't really sort of like bringing pride to the door of these people. Another example, would be, for instance, inaugurating pride benches that can kind of, or raising a flag that were kind of alternative solutions in places where, marching was not an option. And if we want to talk about criminalized settings, film festivals very often sort of kind of become a disguise for pride events, picnics, community picnics, all this kind of, events can kind of take away the pressure of for people to perform as if they are at Pride, and they can kind of build coalitions in a much less, I don't want to use the word threatening, but in a much more subtle way, so that people kind of can negotiate and dip in and out. And it also means that sometimes these events happen and then maybe they don't happen for a few years because they lose capacity and sort of organizational resources, and they kind of like happen ephemerally here and there if and when people can mobilize. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I'm thinking about, because the notion of community has always been so contested, hasn't it, in relation to LGBTQ plus people, and the idea that everybody is, just one big happy family is, we know that that's a myth, and it can sometimes feel very appealing. And sometimes in euphoric moments in a pride parade, we may have felt, oh, we're all in this together and we're sharing this. And there can be moments like that, but they are very ephemeral. And the differences, the political differences amongst people who somehow identify or might be identified as being on the rainbow spectrum in some way, are incredibly strong, as you're pointing out. And obviously, one way of addressing those differences and trying to move beyond conflict is through dialogue or through conversations. So I was wondering if you'd come across, particularly in local prides, particularly, I don't know, I'm thinking about, you mentioned disabled prides and Black prides, trans prides, where you have smaller groups within the larger population who want to have their own events for all kinds of very, very valid reasons. Did you notice people attempting to have difficult conversations to try and increase dialogue, communication, some feeling of solidarity with other constituencies that they may or may not have been in good on very good terms before?
I have more knowledge and experience within the UK because now I'm currently undertaking a little pilot project on alternative pride events and the construction of antagonism and agonism within this sort of arena. And I recently held a workshop with 5 alternative pride organizers who, to various degrees, I mean, obviously, we're not drawing any sort of systematic conclusions from that, but in terms of anecdotal knowledge and some hints for reflection and food for thought, in various degrees, they expressed how this sort of dialogue and sort of question of accountability with mainstream pride are kind of broken down. So for instance, I'm quite involved with the disabled organization here in the UK called Para Pride, and they do LGBTQI advocacy for disabled members of the community, and they were relaying back their experience year on year at London Pride, where they have been consulted with them, they have been giving them feedback, they have been telling them what's wrong with their accessibility policy, and every year they are faced with the same experience, which is quite frustrating, to the point that they've started to consider whether it's worth participating in London Pride at all, because the members of Para Pride who wants to march very often are left under the sun for hours. They're not really given any real support, and it kind of becomes quite a toll for them. So the question of accountability within this sort of democratic bottom up approach is kind of missing in a way, because we have also seen that what scholars such as David Paternotte have called the NGOization of activism has really brought a massive gap between the sort of architecture of pride organization in big places and the actual instances of individuals who are trying to give feedback on what doesn't work at Pride. Very often there is this kind of tokenistic inclusion. There were various problems with this, I don't know, the women's stage and this kind of like gestures that very often didn't really represent much, but also some sort of uncomfortable alliances. So, being sponsored by warfare, sort of arms producers, or this kind of a feedback that very often doesn't really become incorporated. So last year I did another event with an organization based all around the UK called Fossil Free Pride, which were trying to ask Pride events to sign a pledge to abandon fossil sponsors that were, not just investing in fossil fuel technologies or enterprises, but also weapon manufacturers, and the kind of hostility that this kind of initiative has encountered. So there is, I would say at the moment, at least in some countries, and I know that there are others where this is also happening, this sort of a lack of accountability for big pride organizations. The problem is that this is my own sort of like analysis, I would say, until recently they could forget about this feedback because they had massive budgets, they were very successful, they had big turnover, they were growing year on year. So they could afford to forget about the thorns in the side, if we want to call them that. But now some of these events have seen a 70% drop in sponsorships. So when we think about what is happening to Pride, it's not the small alternative prides that are creating a crisis. Mainstream Pride events are already in a crisis, and alternative Pride events, in my opinion, are merely holding a mirror up to the dysfunctions of mainstream Pride. So, for instance, how could you be sponsored by BP, by Shell? How can you be sponsored by BAE Manufacturers, which is, massive weapon production company or enterprise? So these problems are coming, are coming to the surface because they cannot be they cannot be hidden anymore.
Okay. Paolo or Silvia, would you like to come in with questions, or do we have questions from the online chat?
Yeah, I have a question that's got lots of questions that are coming to mind, and some of them I almost don't want to ask because I think it's just kind of existential, like, thinking about the moral failure of some parts of the queer community to learn how to be in empathic kinship with other parts of the queer community, so that when power is given, it is redistributed, it is harnessed, right? It is refused even, right? And it's sort of a psychosocial question, is like with social movements, what happens when parts of social movements acquire power and safety? How easy is it to forget? Is that just how we're made? And whose responsibility is it to educate for empathy? Because that labor often falls onto the more marginalized members of the community, right? And so it's a question that's really bothering me. The one that makes more sense in my mind to ask is about interruptions to Pride events. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about, BLM in Toronto, I think in 2016, which was, which a really important moment. No Pride and Genocide, types of, more interactive with mainstream Pride events. So the act of interruption, the act of pausing, the act of, creating moments of silence. What are your thoughts, and what does your research say about those particular
That's a very interesting question. So I would say two things. Thank you for that. The first one is that one of the things that I was trying to deconstruct in my book is this idea that bigger is better. So this idea that Pride, in order for, obviously there is, safety in numbers, and Pride has been, every social movement relies on showing up, basically. If we all stay home, it's not a social movement. If we are organizing a protest, then we all stay home, right? But Pride has a particular, and because of some of the dynamics that Dennis Altman was describing about commercialization and, willingly embrace it, So basically, this idea that in order for you to be successful, you have to adopt a capitalistic model of growth, projection. So how many people are you going to have in the streets in 2025, 26, 27? Think about the whole infrastructure that exists around things such as World Pride, Euro Pride, where activist groups, so they have to bid to host Pride, and a lot of Pride also, I would say, they are now copyrighted. So there was a problem a few years ago, I think, with the gay village in Padua, where they were trying to sue, I think, another organization, I want to say in Canada, but I'm not sure, that kind of was using the same sort of title of the gay village. This idea that we need to really develop Pride as a capitalistic event, almost as if we're doing Coachella, we're doing Burning Man, we're doing a Taylor Swift concert, right? So that is a problem, and I was trying to undo this narrative, and so many of my participants to the research, which I don't criticize, so I want to make this very clear. It's not like a criticism to them, but they have really internalized this idea that in order for them to be successful, not only they have to grow, but as you say, they cannot interrupt what they're doing. Like, they cannot lose momentum, they cannot drop the ball. So that creates a problem, because it means that if you fail to have a successful event, that it means that you have failed as an activist, whereas there are many physiological reasons why things can change, right? The pandemic, maybe restrictions or legislation that makes people unsafer. I don't know, other unrelated things like, I don't know, a terrorist attack or any other things that may prompt people not to show up. But there's also something else that I've been reading, because I'm doing a book review for this wonderful edited collection that is called Ambivalent Activism, which is edited by Akugo Emejulo and two other authors. And it's a collection of activist and non-activist pieces about how we should allow ourselves and others to feel ambivalent about activism. And one of the chapters that captured my imagination was precisely on interruption. And they kind of were using, the work of David Graeber about, what happens when things fail. Like, for instance, they were talking about Occupy Wall Street, right? And the fact that, but also talked about BLM and the fact that things fizzled out. And, the position of the author, which I don't remember because it's been a bit of a mad few days reading the book. I have notes. Was that in the moment of what scholars call abeyance, or the end of a movement or the interruption of a movement, that in itself is a learning opportunity for democratization, for learning to have a direct experience of organizing that probably people never had before, even if they failed. And this is taken directly from David Graeber. This is probably the closest that people have come in a long time to feeling that they have participated to democratic processes. So the fact that, as I was saying, a small Pride hasn't happened or it gets cancelled. I mean, obviously, if it gets cancelled because the far right has cancelled it, or because the people have been threatened, because people are scared, that is a different kettle of fish, right? But if people feel that they need to recoup, they need to regroup, they need to think about what they're doing, that in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. And this is something, I'm using a lot of UK examples. This is something that UK Black Pride has done this year. So they have said, we're taking a hiatus this year. We're not doing Black Pride. I'm not really, privy to the conversations or the reasons why. I have some speculations. But, in itself, it might be a good thing, because Black Pride has exploded, and they might be thinking about what should we do next. Because also Black Pride has been criticized for, a few reasons, including sponsorships, presence of the police, sort of things like that. So, the question you raised is really about what connotates, what decides, what declares whether a movement has been successful. And it's also the question of, as they were raising in the book, that in some cases we know that change is not happening now, and it's not happening tomorrow. It's probably not happening the day after tomorrow. So it's a bit of a long game. And so we cannot just burn and crash like the sort of, fireflies that just crash into the light and then they're gone, right? So there's this idea also of the temporality of social change that might require a sort of anti-capitalistic gesture of stopping and resting and thinking about what can be done differently.
Thank you.
Camilla.
I'm sorry. I want just to. Thank you, Francesca. This is an incredibly inspiring talk. Lots of ideas, lots of points to discuss. So I'll try really to. I'll start with one question, and then we'll see whether there's time for the 100 more that I have to ask. But nonetheless, I would like to go back to the issue of funding on one hand, the political commitment, and the sense of community or the community building or the feelings of kinship within communities at large. So not just within the LGBTQI plus community, the organizers, those who actively participate in Pride parades, and also in the political workshop, that precedes, of course, the political manifestos and so on and so forth. And I've just been thinking about how, and that's maybe the question, or one of the questions, to begin with, in your experience, in your work, what's the impact, or what has been so far the impact of local prides on the local communities? Because I'm thinking of people parading often in a small context, in a small communities where they live. So it is putting one's own bodies, one's own lives at stake, and which is a very different experience from participating in a bigger march in a big city, which potentially is not the city where you live in. I remember many years ago, my first Pride was in Rome in the year 2000, and it was the World Pride.
Yeah.
And of course, I took a bus anonymously. I went there anonymously, went home. I sort of came out to the people on the bus. At the point, I was so full of enthusiasm, but then I went back home, and that was that. So I would have never thought of, even doing the same kind of experience in a city where I was studying, as a secondary school person, student, and so on. So, but that was helpful. But I guess that nowadays it would be incredibly different, So just, being with my friends in my own communities, and also seeing, however, how, the issue of visibility, inclusion, exclusion, but visibility, invisibility, plays a major role there. And the second point is the impact on the broader community. So what has changed so far in the smaller communities that see this parade, see these people, the colorful bunch of people, which kind of reaction, how is it really changing the conversation, is really changing the access of, what can be visible. And the third point connected to this is what the far right parties, I'm thinking of the UK and thinking of UK reform in particular, they sort of have starting to have quite a significant impact in terms of local decisions, of funding of local events. So this is what I'm trying to connect the three words together. And so several smaller local prides have been cancelled, which is something you mentioned, of course, but just wanted to ask, how, but in these cases, some local communities have sort of self-funded and still carried out the prides, but not everywhere. So I would like to ask you your view on all these points, and especially what's your view on the future. Also keeping in mind maybe the Italian case and the UK, context again, also maybe in a comparative transnational way, just to see what, in your view, is happening and what are future perspectives onto this.
I mean, these are the countries that I have mostly written about in relation to Pride anyway. It's very interesting. For the first part, so the question around what's the impact of small Pride events in the local community. The case that, I know best is the one about Salento and Puglia. And the fact that, I think they're now celebrating around 10 years of organizing Pride either in Lecce or in Gallipoli. I mean, the Pride in Gallipoli doesn't exist anymore. But, back when, this first started, the conversations were around, should we have this? Is this necessary? What is the mission of, what we're doing? Why do we need the pride on the territory? And they were approaching this question with a lot of strategy around changing the minds of their neighbors. This idea that they probably would not impact national politics, of course, but they could have. The thing is that they told me at the time was that you got to speak to your neighbors when you are doing an event like this. As Charlotte was saying, you're putting yourself on the line, so it might be dangerous, but it also means that the kind of stigma has to be lessened in a way, because these are people with whom you can already have conversations, and some unexpected alliances can happen. So for instance, from a personal perspective, there was a cafe. I'm talking now about Gallipoli. This is something I've written about in an article as well. That was Caffè Bellini in the coastal town of Gallipoli, and this started before Pride. Started around 2007, and I was then in Gallipoli with the friends, and someone from Gallipoli said, "Oh, let's go to. I'll show you. Have you shown your friends the faggots bar?" Right? I'm sorry if I use this triggering language, but so this idea of queerness as a spectacle back then was, really, there is this bar, I'll show you, let's drive around and see what are they doing. But like a sort of territory like Gallipoli, it hasn't massively become, the queerest town in Italy, but it has become one of the most important destination for queer tourism, and particularly gay tourism, which in itself, I'm not an expert on tourism, but other people could tell you, the value of LGBT tourism and how this brings kind of these conversations. And that went hand in hand with the creation of Salento Pride, which was held in Gallipoli for a number of years, which then became accused by other activists of just catering to the tourists. So this is something else that sometimes happens, that sometimes the Pride events in places like, I don't know, Playa del Carmen or Gallipoli, they are kind of accused not to be for the local community. And these are events that are just sort of glamorizing party-like sort of endeavors. And so, the impact is also not always direct. So tourism in some cases associated with Pride can be very positive. But on the other hand, as I was saying, small prides are more prone to be directly affected by funding issues because, in the UK, now with reform, Pride has become a very low-hanging fruit to target. And it's quite easy to do that. And there's also misunderstanding that councils are paying thousands of pounds for Pride events, which is obviously not true. Sometimes they only offer logistical support. But we also saw, as you said, in Durham, the miners that were that became the unknowingly great allies of the gay movement in the 80s in the UK. They have actually helped to crowdfund for Durham Pride to happen after funding was pulled from a reform-led Durham Council. So it's for the future in terms of what this means. We need to hold the bar tight in a way, in the sense that we cannot let Pride we already let Pride become cannibalized by corporations, and now they are leaving them in tatters. And we cannot allow that to happen with far-right actors, because all they want is to hollow it out even further and make Pride even less of a political event. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to share a revolutionary left-wing Marxist agenda when you go to Pride. What I am saying is that there has to be an acknowledgement that Pride cannot be neutral. And then depending on the time that we're living, it has to make a statement, and it has to be centered around a human rights agenda. And a Pride that is not centered around a human rights agenda, that is intersectional, that is acknowledging all the different people that are experiencing issues in the community, is, it might as well be a private event rather than a public protest. Sorry, I've just gone a bit on a digression, so I hope that I've touched on
That was
things
really
that you.
helpful, and thank you very much. And yeah, absolutely. And I was also thinking that, just a few days ago, before the Pride in Rome, there were lots of controversies about the Gaza question and
Yeah,
involvement of the Israeli community, gay community, and their positions on Gaza and the genocide. So that was an incredibly political moment of debate. And also, on the other hand, also the gay conservative party with Francesca Pascale,
yeah,
and apparently they have proposed a law against homophobia, which, however, if I read it correctly, but please correct me here, involves only lesbian, gay, and bisexual people and excludes trans people, as well
yes,
as intersexual, all the other letters of the acronym. So this is really the time to be there, to be assertive, and also to make a point about what you were saying. But I have to say, these clashes are really not helpful for the working out of our own agenda as parts of this big community, LGBTQI plus community as a whole. So definitely, as you were saying, the bar needs to be kept incredibly high at the moment, and there's no compromises, I think, that need to be taken, because otherwise they're harmful for all of us, even for those who actually support them. That's my view. And thank you, Francesca. I think there's a question from the chat.
Yeah,
Paolo,
so we're already sort of discussing a number of cases related to Italy in particular, but Stefania from the chat was asking what sets the Italian case apart. So vis-a-vis specific issues that are currently underway,
yeah,
legal issues. I mean, we could start with same-sex marriage and end with the
yeah.
DDL Lizzan and everything in between, sort of responses to that or whatever comes to mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say two things. Obviously, this is based on, I don't want to say on the go thoughts, but, kind of on, extemporary reflection. So take me with a pinch of salt when I say that. The first one I would say is that this idea of LGBTQI plus Italy as the sick man of Europe, or the sick woman of Europe, or the sick non-binary person of Europe. Because, when we look at the rainbow maps, which I've also written about, this idea that Italy always lags behind, we're very behind, we haven't done enough, which, by the way, is absolutely true. I mean, the state of LGBTQI plus rights in Italy is dreadful, right? But they kind of creates this mentality that we are backwards and we are behind, and it's someone's fault, right? And this someone is never easily identifiable, because it was Berlusconi 20 years ago, and now it's other people, and in some cases it's also the left, because we saw what happened with the Cirinna debate and the Zan and debate and all sorts of issues around betrayals that happened in our communities and beyond. So I think that this has created a warped sense of, and also an anger and rage about stagnating social progress. And I think Italian LGBTQI plus movements are extremely frustrated by decades of stonewalling that has been, pardon the pun, but they've been stonewalled by a lot of political actors, and they've also relied on political actors to sort of deliver in some ways. And so I think that the debate has become really sometimes about politics and political visions of Italy, and not necessarily about visions of what the community is. And I think that, this kind of problem is lingering. And obviously the presence of the Catholic Church never helps. But the other thing that I would say is that the presence of a network like Archigay has also massively impacted for many years what Pride looked like in Italy. There's some activists that know this better than me. The whole discussion about Onda Pride, one Pride or several, and sort of like competing for which city would have national Pride this year and the regional Pride, all this kind of. So what we see today is hardly the sort of emergence of an overnight hostility or divisions or animosity. So the fact that the organization of Pride events was very often under the umbrella of Archigay, whether that's good or not, that's not what I'm disputing, but it's quite centralized, it's quite top down, and it kind of has created this idea that there is a detachment between mainstream pride organizations and more grassroots activists. And this is also compounded by global movements. I mean, there's inevitably there has been a cross-national learning that has happened. So the moment in which you see, for instance, that alternative pride events, I don't know, anti-capitalist pride events are happening in London or Paris or Berlin, there is a learning process whereby people ask themselves, should we do that as well? And I think in Italy, with the kind of very strong network of grassroots activism that exists, and also a lot of, antagonists, kind of really socially progressive factions of activism, this has found a very, fecund terrain, So it's not, for instance, a coincidence that if we take the example of Germany that I was mentioning earlier about the whole Antifa debate, right? That is kind of intersecting with the specific politics of Germany. So the kind of politics of activism and of history and of social movements that exist in a country will inevitably affect how activists perceive their role. There is also quite a nostalgia for the progressive left of, the La Quercia and PSI, sort of like, it's kind of like nostalgia for the 90s sometimes, about a sort of like a moment where we kind of had this very unitary vision of progressive politics, which was a fiction anyway. But I think there's a lot of things that are channeled in the Italian case, and also Italy is, has quite dialectical way of doing activism that in some places kind of becomes more muted. So in the UK, you wouldn't have the same amount of litigiosity, if we want to use the title of the talk. So they might hate each other as equally as they do in other countries, but it doesn't emerge in the very antagonistic, very public way that does in Italy, for a series of, organizational, sort of also, like, how do you say, like, sort of like, situational factors. So, when something happens, for instance, you have the emergence of someone like Vannacci that kind of, sparks a whole new wave of discussions in a way in which this hasn't really happened here because Farage has been on the block for a long time. So it's kind of also outright antagonization of the LGBTQI communities produces more reactions, more discussions.
Thank you. There are no other questions in the chat for now. Any other thoughts or questions from our panel here? And thank you, Francesca, for your very rich responses.
My pleasure.
I have a sort of, well, I suppose they're all thorny questions. So it's another potentially thorny question. But I just guess going back to, I think I really agree with everything you've been saying about, and that you show in your research about the dangers of commodifying pride, of it becoming the sort of huge capitalist megalith that, it just keeps growing and growing and sort of, and loses contact with the human dimension. And as a result becomes less able to accommodate all of the different variety that you find within, a rainbow population. But I'm also thinking about the idea of the, everyone is welcome, everybody's welcome in Pride. And I've sort of through the years, I've myself experienced, as many of us have, those debates where, you go to Pride and it's all free. And then you go the next year and you have to pay £10, then you have to pay £20, and now you have to pay £60. And so, the levels of economic barriers that are being erected and the way that people feel about that. And so you have this sense that, you can't say everybody's welcome, because one of the points of Pride, for me, I think, and I think for a lot of people, and it's been written about in the critical literature, and people talk about it, it should be a place where people who are coming out for the first time or wondering, to questioning people, could just kind of go along and see what it's like and maybe find themselves. And it's so much less likely for that to happen if you've got a pay barrier. Okay, so there's that kind of issue. So obviously it's a problem. But then the sponsorship by institutions can also be a way for queer people who work in those businesses to try and get some leverage to improve policies in the workplace. And obviously sometimes it's just a case of pinkwashing, sometimes it's incredibly tokenistic. I've worked at different universities and there have always been discussions about, well, are you going to, if you're going to be in Pride, are you going to walk with the university float, or do you feel that this university is just tokenistically, there are these kind of discussions as well that happen with all kinds of different businesses and organizations. And so it's a bit of a difficult question, isn't it? To
Absolutely.
what extent can Pride be a useful platform for somebody who's struggling with homophobia or any kind of discrimination in the workplace to lobby to make things better? And obviously there are other ways of doing that, and there's local politicians and there's workplace employment law, but it's one of those difficult situations, isn't it, where it's not cut and dried. The police marching in Pride is one very key example of this, isn't it? There are very valid reasons why people have expressed their, their desire for the police perhaps not to be there, but there are also people within that police force who want to transform it from the inside. So that's just one very clear example that kind of crystallizes things in a way that makes us all a bit uncomfortable, but because it's a conversation that needs to happen. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about these challenging questions in relation to what you've written, in relation to where your thoughts are going now.
Thank you for that. I think, kind of going to go back to the book that I'm reading right now about ambivalence, right? About ambivalent activism, because it kind of like raises the question of materiality of Pride and, material conditions that are not easily disentangled. So as you rightly point out. So on the one hand, the commodification of Pride, as you say, has a very strong middle class connotation in terms of Pride is expensive, and people that I have interviewed, they said, when they were setting up their alternative Pride events, that one of the reasons why they were setting them up is because people couldn't travel, they couldn't afford it, they had lost their job during the pandemic, and so there was a real material reason based in sort of working class reflections around, being working class and LGBTQI plus, that kind of really led to the creation of Pride events that were not about leisure consumption, flaunting, and, sort of like conspicuous consumption, like we see, right? The vodka drinking, the sort of like gadget wearing, Pride. And the question of the commodification, the kind of comparison I try to draw is that if any other, and I don't know how helpful this is, if any other social movement tried to adopt the same tactics that Pride has adopted, we kind of laugh at them. Like if the march against Trump had adopted the same commercialization, the Women's March, or if BLM had adopted the same, or if Extinction Rebellion had adopted the same level of commodification, we kind of would find it odd in a way, but we don't find it odd when we think about Pride. And that, for me, in itself is why this needs to be deconstructed, right? But then also you mentioned the question of the workplace, and we know that LGBTQI plus people tend to be employed in lower paying positions. They very often face sexual harassment, hostility, discrimination. They're not out at work, or when they are, it might hinder their progression and things like that. And so I think that there is a sense that in some cases, visibility about workplace and inclusion could be negotiated. But it's now become a kind of an excuse to just anything goes. It has become more muted over the years. So, this idea of sponsors occupying large floats or, having these massive trucks is kind of dying out a bit. And it's connected also to questions around environmental sustainability. But I also think that people have been let down. I mean, many of the people that have participated to Pride that were, I don't know, employed by Target, if we think about the US, if we think about banks that have now excluded trans customers from using toilets, or Barclays, for instance, right? So even them are experiencing a sense of disaffection. So there is a reconsideration of were they even ever for us? And so is it right for me to march under their banner? So if the institution, you mentioned the university, which we all have various degrees of, bad experiences with, right? So if I'm not being treated correctly, should I use my identity to their favor? Because I am doing them a favor by marching for them, rather than them doing a favor for me. So I think that people kind of renegotiate what it means to belong in the workplace. And I think it goes also hand to hand with this idea of the disaffection of people in the work environment, this disillusion about belonging in general in the workplace, and when being more strategic and less sort of like kinship-like a relationship in a way. So I think that we'll see a reconfiguration of this in a way that is probably more scattered and less let's send 50 people on the Primark contingent or the Nando's contingent, or I don't know, any other brand, and more about questioning whether people should be marching for them, and whether there are the other affinity groups that they can march for, knowing that, the institution will never love you back, or the workplace will never love you back. So I don't know if this is also kind of a response to late stage capitalism, where we work, but we are not under the pretense that our jobs are loving us, or that we can expect to be loved by people who manage us. And so I'm curious. I don't have an answer. I'm ambivalent when it comes to this. And it would be very easy for me, because I'm of my queer politics extraction, to, be saying, queer capitalism and very pinkwash, which is what happens in the literature. But I'm also very wary that, material resources are important for people. Money for queer people is important. Because you can make the difference between safety and unsafety in some cases.
No, I think that word of ambivalence is a really interesting, and it's a productive space, isn't it? It doesn't mean sort of stepping away. It means sitting with the difficulties, staying with the trouble. So there's always space for Donna Haraway in every discussion of kinship. But that idea of not trying to make anything neat, and not trying to make any of these ideas go away, but sticking with the ambivalence, and things will develop obviously in lots of different ways. But I think one of the things that I find so exciting and generative about your research is the way that you have mapped this diversification of different prides, and that there are so many different things happening at so many different levels. And many of us will already be aware of that in maybe a few locations where we spend time, but it is the transnational, the global dimension of what you've done, which I think makes it such an important contribution. And it will be really interesting to see how things develop over the coming years, as I think Pride events will become ever more related. One thing we haven't talked about today, but I think we do need to draw things to a close, is just the relationship between Pride Month and LGBTQ History Months, where they exist, because they don't exist in every country. And that obviously, I mean, that they are different times of the year. And it's great that there are these 2 months in a lot of places where different kinds of events are happening, and maybe different kinds of conversations and memorialization and commemoration are happening in the History Month and in the Pride Month. But that also is an interesting sort of how those 2 points of the year interact and are in dialogue with each other in terms of the different activities that happen, or how things that happen in History Month may facilitate different kinds of Pride celebrations. Who can say? But I think it's time to leave it here. But Francesca, thank you so much. That was such an interesting and enriching conversation. And we're just so grateful that you could spend some time with us and share your research and that you've been publishing such brilliant articles and books, which I hope will have a really wide readership. And thank you for being with us today. Those of you who are listening to this online or who are listening to the recording, do please follow us. Watch out for our new events, which will be advertised at the autumn. We're going to take a bit of a break over the summer, but there will be more conversations about queer kinship. And if you'd like to get involved, then do get in touch. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you for having me. It's been a massive pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank
Grazie
you.
Francesca, alla prossima,
Grazie.
arrivederci. Ciao.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao.